The sequel decision, what the numbers UNLOCKD, the financial performance of The Housemaid had direct and immediate consequences for the future of the franchise. In January 2026, Lionsgate officially announced that a sequel had been greenlit. The sequel is to be an adaptation of The Housemaid's Secret, the second book in Freida McFadden's Housemaid series, and Paul Feig and Sydney Sweeney are both confirmed to return. Michele Morrone is also set to return. This greenlight decision was made possible entirely by the financial success of the first film. When a studio invests $35 million in a production and gets nearly $400 million back from theaters alone, before home video, streaming rights, digital rental and purchase revenue, and television licensing fees are factored in, the decision to continue the franchise is not difficult to make. The numbers speak with absolute clarity, and in this case what they said was that audiences wanted more of this world and these characters. Streaming and home release revenue, the theatrical gross, spectacular as it is, represents only one dimension of the film's total financial picture. After its theatrical run concluded, The Housemaid became available for purchase and rental on major digital platforms including Prime Video and Apple TV. Digital sales and rental revenue for a film of this popularity can add tens of millions of dollars to the overall financial total, and The Housemaid's strong audience enthusiasm suggests that its home release performance was equally impressive. Physical media sales, Blu-ray and DVD, represent a smaller but still meaningful revenue stream. Television licensing fees, both for premium cable channels and broadcast networks, add further. And ultimately the streaming rights deal, which determines how and where the film will live in its long-term afterlife, represents a potentially enormous financial event depending on the terms negotiated. All of these revenue streams combined mean that the film's total lifetime financial return to its studio and producers will significantly exceed even the impressive theatrical gross it achieved in theaters. Comparison to other films. Putting the numbers in perspective to fully appreciate what The Housemaid achieved financially, it helps to compare it to other films in similar territory. The film's budget-to-gross ratio of more than 11:1 puts it in extraordinarily rare company. For reference, a film that earns 2 or 3 times its production budget at the worldwide box office is generally considered a financial success. A film that earns 5 times its budget is exceptional. A film that earns more than 10 times its budget is, in most years, one of the most financially efficient productions in the entire industry. The Housemaid crossed the threshold where it began to be compared to much older films that achieved legendary ratios of return. The fact that analysts were drawing comparisons to films that famously outperformed their budgets by enormous multiples speaks to just how unusual the film's financial performance was in the context of contemporary Hollywood. For Sydney Sweeney personally, the film also represented a significant financial rehabilitation. Her previous several films had underperformed at the domestic box office, with none topping $50 million domestically in the period before The Housemaid. The success of this film confirmed her status as a genuine box office draw and significantly strengthened her position in Hollywood negotiations going forward. Final thoughts on the budget story. The financial story of The Housemaid 2025 is, in many ways, as compelling as the film itself. A modest $35 million investment transformed into nearly $400 million of theatrical revenue, driven by strong performances, sharp direction, a devoted pre-existing fanbase for the source novel, and word-of-mouth enthusiasm that sustained the film's theatrical run long past the point when most of its competitors had faded. It is a story that reminds Hollywood of something the industry occasionally needs to be reminded of, that audiences do not always need spectacle, franchise legacy, or a $200 million budget to show up in enormous numbers. Sometimes a well-crafted story, a talented cast, and genuine emotional engagement are worth more than all the visual effects money can buy. The theatrical run, an extraordinary hold in Hollywood. The measure of a film's true commercial strength is not just its opening weekend but how it holds in subsequent weeks. A film that opens big and then drops 60 or 70% in its second weekend is typically one that benefited from marketing-driven opening weekend curiosity but failed to deliver an experience that made audiences want to recommend it to others. A film that holds strongly from week to week, dropping only a small percentage of its audience each weekend, is one that is generating genuine enthusiasm through word of mouth. By this measure, The Housemaid was one of the most impressive performers of its year. In its second weekend, the film dropped only 19.5% from its opening weekend total, bringing in $15.3 million. A second weekend drop of under 20% is extraordinary by Hollywood standards. It is the kind of hold that speaks to an audience that loved the film and told everyone they knew about it. It is the kind of hold that separates a solid performer from a genuine cultural phenomenon. The film then made $15.1 million in its third weekend, holding essentially flat from its second weekend, which is almost unheard of in modern theatrical distribution. At this point, industry observers and box office analysts were genuinely stunned by what they were seeing. Films simply do not hold this well unless something very powerful is happening with the audience response. The fourth weekend brought in $10.1 million, and the fifth weekend contributed $8.5 million. Even by this stage of the theatrical run, The Housemaid was still performing at a level that many films never reach even in their opening weekends. The cumulative effect of this sustained performance was a total domestic gross that climbed steadily and impressively over the weeks following its release. A significant factor in this extraordinary word-of-mouth performance was the role of BookTok, the community of book enthusiasts on the TikTok platform, in promoting both the original novel and the film adaptation. Frida McFadden's novel had already built a devoted and vocal following within the BookTok community, and those readers became passionate advocates for the film, driving their followers to theaters in numbers that sustained the film's performance long past the point when most thrillers of this type would have faded from the box office conversation. Domestic versus international performance. One of the most interesting aspects of The Housemaid's box office story is the split between its domestic and international performance. The film ultimately earned approximately $123.7 million from North American theaters, a strong domestic total for a mid-budget thriller within our rating. But what made the global picture truly spectacular was the international performance. The film's overseas earnings climbed to approximately $231 million by the time its international run was in its later stages. This means that international audiences actually embraced the film even more enthusiastically than domestic audiences did, which is a pattern that not all American thrillers achieve. Many films are heavily skewed toward domestic earnings, particularly those that rely on cultural references or character types that do not translate easily across borders. The Housemaid, with its universal themes of power, vulnerability, deception, and survival, clearly resonated with audiences around the world regardless of their cultural background. The performances of Sydney Sweeney and Amanda Seyfried in particular appear to have connected with international viewers, and the film's glossy, stylized aesthetic, reminiscent of the kind of international art house thrillers that regularly perform well in global markets, likely contributed to its overseas appeal. The final worldwide total, and what it means by the time The Housemaid completed its full theatrical run, the film had grossed $399.2 million worldwide against its $35 million production budget. That is a return of more than 11 times the production budget, an almost unbelievable ratio that places the film among the most financially efficient productions in Hollywood in recent memory. To put this in context, the film had a break-even point of approximately $87.5 million. Against that baseline, the film generated a box office surplus, the amount earned above and beyond the break-even point, of more than $300 million. That is a figure that very few films ever achieve, and the fact that The Housemaid achieved it on a budget of just $35 million makes it all the more remarkable. The film ranked among the top 20 highest-grossing films of 2025 globally, sitting just behind Ryan Coogler's critically celebrated film Sinners in the annual worldwide charts. For a mid-budget psychological thriller with an R rating to place that high in the annual box office rankings, competing directly with major franchise films and animated blockbusters, is a genuinely historic achievement. The Housemaid also became Paul Feig's second highest-grossing film as a director, trailing only his 2011 comedy Bridesmaids, which earned $289.1 million worldwide. Whether The Housemaid ultimately surpassed Bridesmaids in the final tally speaks to how strong the film's extended run was. The break-even point. What the film needed to earn just to cover itself. Understanding the break-even point for a Hollywood film requires understanding a rule that the industry applies broadly when analyzing a film's financial performance. The generally accepted standard is that a film needs to earn approximately 2.5 times its production budget at the worldwide box office in order to break even. This multiplier exists because the production budget is not the only cost associated with releasing a film. There are also enormous marketing and distribution costs that are entirely separate from production. The marketing campaign for a film like The Housemaid, which included trailer production and distribution, digital advertising across multiple platforms, physical advertising in theaters and on billboards, press junkets, premiere events, and ongoing promotional activity, easily runs into tens of millions of dollars on its own. Distribution costs, which cover the logistics of getting a film into thousands of theaters around the world, add further to the total financial outlay. When you add these costs to the production budget, and when you account for the fact that theaters keep a significant portion of the ticket sales they generate, the actual amount of money that needs to flow back to the studio and the producers before a film is genuinely profitable is substantially higher than the production budget alone would suggest. For The Housemaid, with its $35 million production budget, the break-even point using the 2.5 times multiplier rule worked out to approximately $87.5 million. That was the number the film needed to hit at the global box office just to cover all of its costs and begin generating actual profit. It is a meaningful target, but given the scale of the film's eventual performance, it turns out to have been a threshold that The Housemaid cleared by an almost incomprehensible margin. Opening weekend, the first signal of something SPCIO when a film opens in theaters. The opening weekend numbers are the first and most closely watched financial signal. They tell the industry how audiences are responding, how effectively the marketing campaign worked, and whether the film has the foundation to sustain a long theatrical run or whether it will drop off sharply after its first few days. The Housemaid opened in the United States on December 19, 2025. On its first day of wide release, the film made $8 million, which included $2.3 million from Thursday night preview screenings. Preview screenings, which take place on Thursday evenings before a film's official Friday opening, are increasingly important in the modern box office landscape because they give studios an early read on audience enthusiasm and help generate social media conversation before the first full weekend. The opening weekend total came in at $19 million from 3,015 theaters across the United States and Canada. This placed the film in third position at the domestic box office for that weekend, behind Avatar, Fire and Ash and David, but it was a strong result given the competitive environment and the film's modest budget. The studio had projected an opening weekend in the range of $20 to $25 million, so the final number came in slightly below the upper end of those projections. But what happened next is what makes this financial story truly remarkable. The Housemaid, 2025, complete budget and box office financial BREKDOW9TRODUCTION. Why budget matters in understanding a film's SUCCSS. When we talk about a movie, we often focus on the story, the performances, the direction, and the overall quality of the filmmaking. But there is an entire financial dimension to every Hollywood production that is just as important, and just as fascinating as anything that happens on screen. The budget of a film tells you a great deal about the risks that were taken, the decisions that were made, and whether the final result can be called a success by the people who actually invested in it. In the case of The Housemaid 2025, the financial story is genuinely extraordinary, and it is one of the most impressive stories in Hollywood that year. So let us break it all down in full detail. The production budget. How much did it cost to make? The estimated production budget for The Housemaid was $35 million. That is the figure that has been reported across industry tracking platforms and entertainment financial publications, and it is the number that serves as the baseline for every financial conversation about this film. Now, $35 million sounds like a lot of money to most people, and of course it is a significant sum in any ordinary context. But within the landscape of modern Hollywood filmmaking, $35 million is actually a relatively modest budget. To put that in perspective, major superhero films and blockbuster franchise entries routinely cost between $200 million and $300 million to produce, sometimes even more when you account for all the visual effects, extensive reshoots, and the enormous scale of those productions. Even mid-range studio films with recognizable stars frequently come in at $70, $80, or $100 million in production costs. So $35 million places The Housemaid firmly in what the industry considers the moderate or mid-budget range for a studio film. It is not a tiny independent production made on a shoestring, but it is also nowhere near the upper tier of Hollywood spending. This budget level reflects a very specific set of decisions made by the filmmakers and the studio, Lionsgate, about what kind of film they were making and how they intended to make it. The production began principal photography on January 3, 2025, in New Jersey, and wrapped in March 2025. That means the entire shooting period was approximately 2 to 3 months, which is a relatively tight schedule that reflects the modest budget. A more expensive production might have a shooting schedule that extends over 5 or 6 months, allowing for more elaborate setups, more takes, more time to refine individual scenes. The Housemaid was made with efficiency as a core operating principle, and the final product demonstrates that efficiency does not have to mean compromise in quality when a skilled director, a strong cast, and a sharp screenplay are working in alignment. What does $35 million actually pay for in a production like this? The budget covers a wide range of costs. Actor salaries are typically one of the largest line items in any film budget, and with performers of the caliber of Sydney Sweeney, Amanda Seyfried, and Brandon Sklenar attached, those salaries would have represented a meaningful portion of the total. The director's fee, the producer fees, the screenwriter's compensation, all of these above-the-line costs come out of the production budget. Below the line, the budget covers the cost of the crew, cinematographers, camera operators, lighting technicians, sound engineers, production designers, set decorators, costume designers, makeup artists, hairstylists, stunt coordinators, and the dozens of other specialized professionals whose work makes a film look and feel the way it does. The cost of the locations, including the primary filming location in New Jersey, which doubled for the Long Island estate central to the story, would also have been a significant expense. Post-production costs, including editing, color grading, sound mixing, and the composition and recording of the film's musical score by Theodore Shapiro, are also absorbed within the production budget. Shapiro's score, which was his eighth collaboration with director Paul Feig, was an important element of the film's atmosphere and tension, and music production at that level does not come cheaply. Visual effects, while not a major component of a psychological thriller of this nature, still represent a cost. Even films that do not rely heavily on digital effects require some degree of visual enhancement and cleanup in post-production, and those costs add up. Michele Morrone, the international PRSENC early life and background. Michele Morrone was born on October 4, 1990, in Melegnano, a small town in the province of Milan in the Lombardy region of northern Italy. His early life was marked by significant hardship that he has spoken about publicly with considerable openness. He grew up in difficult circumstances, with family instability that created an early life that was far from secure or comfortable. He discovered acting as a teenager and recognized it as both a passion and a potential pathway out of the circumstances he had grown up in. He pursued formal training and began working in the Italian entertainment industry from a relatively young age, navigating a professional landscape that is different in important ways from the American film industry but equally demanding in its own right. Career in Italy. Michele Morrone began his career in Italian television and theater, building a reputation in his home country before breaking internationally. He appeared in various Italian television productions, working steadily in a market where he was developing his craft and his professional relationships. He also worked as a model in Italy, which provided financial stability during the early years of his acting career and gave him experience in front of cameras in a commercial context. His physical presence, tall, dark-featured, and possessing the kind of magnetism that translates powerfully to screen, made him a natural fit for modeling work, and that work in turn informed his screen presence as an actor. The international breakthrough. 365 Days. The role that introduced Michele Morrone to a global audience was Massimo Torricelli in the Polish erotic thriller film 365 Days, which was released on Netflix in 2020. The film, based on the novel by Blanka Lipinska, became one of the most watched films on Netflix at the time of its release, generating enormous viewership numbers from audiences around the world. The film is deeply controversial in terms of its content and the messages it conveys about relationships and consent, but its commercial performance was undeniable. Morrone's performance as Massimo, brooding, intense, and possessed of a screen presence that many viewers found impossible to look away from, made him an overnight international phenomenon. He became one of the most recognized European actors on the global stage almost overnight, his face and name suddenly familiar to audiences from dozens of countries who had never encountered his previous Italian work. The role was both a gift and a complication for his career. The gift was obvious: global recognition, international opportunities, and a platform that few actors achieve regardless of how hard they work. The complication was the danger of being entirely defined by a single role in a single type of film, particularly a role that is as specific and as controversial as Massimo Torricelli. He appeared in the sequels, 365 Days, This Day, and the next 365 Days, maintaining his presence in the franchise while simultaneously working to diversify his filmography beyond it. Beyond 365 Days, Morrone has been deliberate in his efforts to demonstrate range beyond the role that made him famous internationally. He has pursued Italian-language projects, international co-productions, and roles that place him in entirely different generic contexts from the erotic thriller world of his most recognized work. His casting in The Housemaid as Enzo Accardi, the Italian groundskeeper, was an important step in that diversification. The film placed him in a major American production alongside highly regarded performers, under the direction of a well-respected filmmaker, in a role that required him to contribute to a complex ensemble narrative rather than simply being a central magnetic figure, as he was in 365 Days. He has also pursued a parallel career as a musician, recording and releasing music in both Italian and English. Music has been a lifelong passion for him, and he has been transparent about the fact that it is not simply a commercial side project but a genuine creative outlet that matters to him independently of its relationship to his acting career. Personal life: Michele Morrone was previously married to Ruba Sada, a Lebanese fashion designer, with whom he has 2 sons. The marriage ended in divorce, which he has spoken about as one of the most painful periods of his life. The pressure of the divorce coincided with a difficult period in his career, and he has been open about having experienced significant depression and personal struggle during that time. He has spoken about finding his way through that difficult period through a combination of therapy, work, and a renewed focus on the things that gave his life meaning: his children, his art, and his determination to build something lasting from the opportunities that had come to him unexpectedly. He maintains a passionate public presence on social media, where he has built an enormous following. He is fluent in Italian, Polish, and English, which reflects both the international scope of his career and his genuine engagement with the different worlds he has moved between professionally. Personal life: Amanda Seyfried has spoken openly about her struggles with anxiety and obsessive-compulsive disorder throughout her life and career. She has been a public advocate for mental health awareness and has discussed her own experiences with therapy and medication in a way that is candid and intended to reduce the stigma around these issues. She married actor Thomas Sadowski in 2017, and the couple have 2 children together. She has spoken about motherhood as a transformative experience, and about the ways it has affected her relationship to her work and to her sense of self. She is deeply connected to her farm in New York State, where she lives with her family and raises animals. This rural life is clearly important to her sense of balance and groundedness, offering a counterweight to the inherently transient and often unreal world of film production. Brandon Sklenar, the rising FORC early life and background. Brandon Sklenar was born on January 6, 1992, in Susquehanna, New Jersey, a small township in Morris County. New Jersey is, of course, immediately adjacent to New York City, and growing up in that orbit gives young people in the arts a certain proximity to the professional world without being entirely inside it, which can be a healthy way to develop. Sklenar grew up in a relatively ordinary suburban environment, and there was nothing particularly predictable about his path toward becoming a prominent Hollywood actor. He studied acting formally, attending the Lee Strasberg Theater and Film Institute in New York City. The Lee Strasberg Institute is one of the most storied acting schools in the United States, built around the principles of method acting that Strasberg himself developed and taught to actors including Al Pacino, Dustin Hoffman, and many others. Training at Strasberg means immersion in a philosophy of acting that prioritizes emotional truth above all else. The idea that a performance is only as real as the genuine emotional experience behind it. That training is evident in the specificity and the grounded quality that Sklenar brings to his work. Early career: Brandon Sklenar's early career followed the pattern familiar to most working actors, a combination of smaller film roles, television appearances, and the kind of sustained, patient effort that the industry demands from people who have not yet had their breakthrough. He appeared in a range of projects across different genres during this period, building his craft in conditions that were not always glamorous but were always educational. He appeared in smaller independent film productions during this period, developing his range and his technique, while the larger industry gradually became aware of him. He also did television work, guest appearances and supporting roles that gave him experience in front of cameras at scale and working within the particular rhythms of episodic production. The breakthrough. It ends with Us, the role that transformed Brandon Sklenar from a working actor into a genuinely prominent one was Atlas Correa in the 2024 film adaptation of Colleen Hoover's enormously popular novel It Ends With Us. The film starred Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, and it was one of the most anticipated and discussed films of its year. The Colleen Hoover book has a fanbase of passionate and devoted readers who followed every aspect of the production with intense interest. Sklenar played Atlas, a character who represents a kind of alternative possibility in the life of the story's protagonist, a man who is gentle, emotionally present, and genuinely caring in contrast to the more troubled central relationship of the narrative. It is a role that requires a specific kind of quiet masculinity, not aggressive or showy, but deeply felt and entirely believable. Sklenar delivered it with a naturalness that won over both the dedicated fandom of the book and general audiences who were encountering his work for the first time. It Ends With Us became a significant box office success, and Sklenar's performance was repeatedly highlighted as one of its strongest elements. It put him on the map in a way that nothing previous had, and it led directly to the opportunities that followed. Drop and further work. He followed his It Ends With Us success with a role in the thriller film Drop, which further demonstrated his ability to anchor intense, high-stakes material. The film showed that his appeal was not limited to a single romantic mode. He could carry the weight of a thriller narrative just as effectively. His casting as Andrew Winchester in The Housemaid was therefore not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention. Here was a director and a production looking for an actor who could play magnetic, attractive, and deeply dangerous, someone who could make an audience understand how a man like Andrew could go so long without being held accountable, because he is simply so convincing in his performance of normalcy. Sklenar understood that assignment completely. His Andrew is one of the film's great achievements because he never once plays the character as obviously villainous. The monstrousness is always underneath something that looks, from certain angles, almost reasonable. Personal life. Sklenar has maintained a relatively private personal life, particularly compared to some of his co-stars. He is known to be deeply committed to his craft and to take the preparation aspect of his work extremely seriously, which is consistent with his Strasbourg training. He has spoken about the importance of fully inhabiting a character before production begins and of finding the internal logic of even the most extreme character choices. He has expressed enthusiasm for physical training as part of his character preparation, and the controlled, assured physicality he brings to his performances reflects that commitment. He is based between New York and Los Angeles, maintaining connections to both the independent theatrical world he came from and the larger Hollywood industry he has increasingly become part of. Amanda Seyfried, the standout performer. Early life and background. Amanda Michele Seyfried was born on December 3, 1985, in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Allentown is a mid-sized city in the Lehigh Valley region of Pennsylvania, and Seyfried grew up in a household that was supportive of creative pursuits. Her father, Jack Seyfried, worked as a pharmacist, and her mother, Anne, was an occupational therapist. It was a stable, middle-class household that gave Amanda a grounded upbringing that she has credited with keeping her anchored throughout the more turbulent phases of her career. From a very young age, Amanda showed exceptional aptitude in two areas: acting and singing. She began modeling at age 11, which gave her early exposure to the professional world of image and performance. She also trained seriously as a classical soprano, taking voice lessons for years and developing a vocal instrument that would later become a significant asset in her film work. Alongside her voice training, she studied piano and developed a genuine love of music that was not simply instrumental to her career but a deeply personal part of who she was. She attended William Allen High School in Allentown, where she was active in theater and the performing arts. She graduated early, at 17, which speaks to her intellectual capability alongside her creative gifts. She was not someone who stumbled into acting accidentally or who drifted toward it without direction. She pursued it with clarity and commitment from an early age. Early career: modeling and television. Before her film career took off, Amanda worked extensively as a model throughout her teenage years. This work gave her financial stability at a young age and introduced her to the mechanics of the entertainment and fashion industries. However, modeling was always a means to an end for her rather than a destination. Her real ambition was acting. Her acting career began in earnest on television. She joined the cast of the long-running American soap opera As the World Turns in 2000, playing a recurring role. Soap operas are, in many ways, an extraordinary training ground for young actors. The volume of material, the speed of production, the requirement to perform emotionally complex scenes on tight schedules with minimal preparation, all of it forces a young performer to develop skills very quickly. Amanda's time on As the World Turns was formative in exactly this way. She also appeared in the television series All My Children, another prominent American soap opera, which further expanded her experience in high-volume dramatic television production. The role that first brought her to genuine mainstream attention, however, was in the teen drama series Veronica Mars, created by Rob Thomas. Amanda joined the show in its first season in 2004, playing Lily Kane, a character who is murdered before the events of the series begin, and whose death drives the central mystery of the entire first season. It is a role that requires the actress to be present largely in flashbacks and memories, which means she had to create a character who felt fully alive and real even though she only appears in fragments. She succeeded brilliantly, and her work on Veronica Mars became one of the most praised aspects of an already celebrated show. The film breakthrough, Mean Girls. The film that introduced Amanda Seyfried to the widest possible audience was Mean Girls, the 2014 comedy written by Tina Fey and directed by Mark Waters. The film was a massive commercial and cultural success, becoming one of the defining teen comedies of its era and building a cultural legacy that has only grown in the 2 decades since its release. Amanda played Karen Smith, one of the members of the Plastics, the socially dominant clique at the center of the film. Karen is written as cheerfully, almost magnificently dim-witted, and the role could easily have become a one-note caricature in less capable hands. Amanda brought a warmth and a genuine comic timing to the character that made Karen not just funny but genuinely lovable. Her performance in Mean Girls demonstrated something important about her abilities. She could be funny without being mean about it. She could play a character who is deliberately written as not very intelligent without making the audience feel contempt for that character. It is a specific and valuable skill, and she had it naturally. Mean Girls made her a household name among a generation of teenage audiences, and it opened doors in Hollywood that might otherwise have taken years longer to pry open. Mamma Mia and the musical dimension of Mean Girls established Amanda Seyfried as a bankable film actress, then Mamma Mia. The 2008 musical film adaptation of the Broadway show built around the music of ABBA demonstrated the full scope of her talents to an international audience. She played Sophie, the young bride-to-be at the center of the story, and the role required her to be not just an actress but a genuine musical performer, singing, dancing, and carrying the emotional weight of a film that was built around music. Amanda's soprano voice was an absolute revelation in the film. She had spent years training as a classical singer, and Mamma Mia gave her the platform to show that training to the world. Her vocal performances in the film were stunning, pure, powerful, and emotionally connected in a way that elevated the material above what the story alone might have achieved. She held her own alongside Meryl Streep and Pierce Brosnan, which is no small accomplishment. The film was a massive worldwide hit, grossing hundreds of millions of dollars and creating an audience for Amanda Seyfried that truly spanned generations and continents. The sequel, Mamma Mia Here We Go Again, released in 2018, brought her back in the same role with similar success. Career depth. A decade of diverse roles. What followed Mamma Mia was a decade of work that demonstrated the genuine range Amanda Seyfried was capable of. She did not stay in the lane that her early successes had defined for her. She moved deliberately between genres, tones, and scales of production, always looking for roles that would challenge her and expand what the industry and the audience understood she could do. She starred in Dear John in 2010, a romantic drama adapted from the Nicholas Sparks novel, opposite Channing Tatum. The film was a significant commercial success. She followed it with Red Riding Hood, a Gothic fantasy thriller in 2011, which showed her willingness to take on darker material. Jennifer's Body, in which she appeared alongside Megan Fox, was a horror comedy that has since gained a significant cult following. Her performance in that film has been reassessed upward in recent years as the film itself has been recognized as a more interesting and subversive piece of work than it was initially given credit for. She starred in the musical film Les Miserables in 2012, one of the most celebrated film musicals of the decade, alongside Hugh Jackman, Russell Crowe, and Anne Hathaway. Playing Cosette in that production, bringing her classical vocal training to bear on material of that historical and artistic weight, was a significant achievement. She delivered one of the most praised performances of her career in Lovelace, the 2013 biographical film about adult film actress Linda Lovelace. It was a courageous and fully committed performance in a difficult role, and it earned her some of the most serious critical attention of her career up to that point. She appeared in While We're Young, a Baumbach film in 2014, and in Ted 2 the same year, demonstrating her continued comfort with comedy alongside dramatic work. Her performance in First Reformed, a 2017 drama directed by Paul Schrader and starring Ethan Hawke, is considered by many critics to be among the finest of her career. The film is a quiet, devastating examination of faith, despair, and the individual's relationship to a broken world, and Seyfried's work in it is restrained, precise, and deeply moving. The film earned widespread critical acclaim and demonstrated that she was capable of operating at the very highest levels of serious dramatic cinema. She starred in Mank, David Fincher's 2020 Netflix film about screenwriter Herman J. Mankiewicz, and the creation of Citizen Kane, playing the actress Marion Davies. The role required her to capture a specific historical figure with wit, warmth, and depth, and she succeeded in a way that earned her an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actress, one of the highest formal recognitions of her abilities as a dramatic performer. White Lotus and further recognition around the same period as her Euphoria success, Sidney delivered another acclaimed performance in the HBO limited series The White Lotus, created by Mike White. The show, which is set at a luxury Hawaiian resort and examines the dynamics between wealthy guests and the resort staff who serve them, gave Sidney a role that was very different from Cassie Howard, subtler, more contained, operating largely through suggestion and implication rather than emotional explosion. Her work in The White Lotus earned her a second Emmy nomination, making her one of the very few performers in that particular awards year to receive nominations in two separate categories. It was a demonstration of her range that silenced critics who had wondered whether her Euphoria performance was specific to that particular type of emotionally volatile character. Film career. Expanding the portfolio. Sidney's film career has grown steadily alongside her television work. She starred in the horror film Immaculate in 2024, in which she also served as a producer, a reflection of her growing ambition to have creative control over her projects rather than simply being a performer for hire. The film received a mixed critical reception but was notable for Sydney's committed central performance and for the clarity of vision she brought to the project. She starred in Madam Web, a Marvel-adjacent superhero film, in 2024. The film itself was poorly received by critics, but Sydney's participation in a project of that scale confirmed her status as a bankable lead performer. She also appeared in Anyone But You, a romantic comedy that surprised industry observers by becoming a significant commercial success, demonstrating that her audience appeal transcended any single genre. Personal life. Sydney Sweeney has been open about various aspects of her personal life while also being deliberate about what she chooses to make public. She has spoken extensively about the financial realities of being a working actor in Hollywood, making headlines with honest comments about how even a successful actor at her level faces real financial pressures, particularly when that actor has chosen to invest in their own projects, as she has. She has been in a relationship with Jonathan Davino, a businessman from Chicago, and the two have been engaged. She has spoken about wanting to maintain a life outside of Hollywood and has expressed genuine attachment to her roots and her family in Washington state. She is also a passionate car enthusiast. She has restored vintage vehicles, she follows motorsports seriously, and she has spoken about this aspect of her life in interviews with the same enthusiasm she brings to discussing her film projects. It is one of the ways she maintains an identity that is entirely her own outside of the roles she plays. What the story is really about on its surface, The Housemaid is a psychological thriller about secrets and manipulation inside a wealthy household. But what it is really about runs deeper than that. It is about the way vulnerability is exploited by those with power. It is about the structures, social, legal, familial, that protect abusive men and punish the women who try to escape them. It is about the strange, complicated bonds that can form between women who are both caught inside the same trap, even when they do not fully trust each other. And it is about what it looks like when women who have been underestimated finally decide to stop surviving and start acting. The Housemaid is not a comfortable story. It is not meant to be. It is the kind of film that stays with you because the questions it raises do not have easy answers, and the choices its characters make do not fit neatly into categories of right and wrong. It is messy and dark and sometimes genuinely disturbing. And it is, for exactly those reasons, a story worth sitting with long after it is over. Sydney Sweeney. The early life and background. Sydney Bernice Sweeney was born on September 12, 1997, in Spokane, Washington. She grew up in a small town called Spokane Valley, and her early childhood was far from the glamorous world she would eventually come to inhabit professionally. Her family was working class, and from a very young age Sydney demonstrated an unusual level of drive and ambition that set her apart from her peers. She was not a child who simply dreamed of becoming an actress. She was a child who made concrete plans and pursued them with a focus that most adults struggle to maintain. When Sydney was 12 years old, she attended a local theater production and walked away from it with a certainty that acting was what she wanted to do with her life. She went home and presented her parents with a formal business plan, an actual written document outlining her goals, her strategy, and the steps she intended to take to build an acting career. She included details like how she planned to handle her education alongside her career, and she laid out the financial considerations with a level of maturity that was extraordinary for a child her age. Her parents were impressed enough by the seriousness and thoughtfulness of the plan that they agreed to support her. The family relocated to Los Angeles so that Sydney could pursue auditions and representation. This was a significant sacrifice on her family's part, uprooting their lives and moving across the country for a 12-year-old's dream, and Sydney has spoken about that sacrifice openly and with deep gratitude throughout her career. She has also spoken about how much pressure she felt because of it, knowing that her family had given up a great deal to give her this opportunity. Growing up in Spokane also gave Sydney a set of interests and skills that would become important parts of her public identity. She was an outdoor enthusiast, trained in mixed martial arts, and had a genuine passion for cars and motorsports that was not at all typical for someone in her eventual industry. These aspects of her personality, the fact that she was genuinely multifaceted and did not fit neatly into the expected mold of a young Hollywood actress, would later become part of what made her such an interesting public figure. Early career. The slow build. Sydney's early career was exactly what most young actors in Hollywood experience: a long, patient accumulation of small roles, guest appearances, and supporting parts that built experience without yet building a major public profile. She was doing this work from a very young age, appearing in projects while still a teenager, and the range of those early roles was wide. One of her earliest significant appearances was in the 2012 film titled An American Girl, Sage Paints the Sky, where she played a supporting role. She followed this with guest spots on various television series, including Criminal Minds, where she appeared in a single episode, and other procedural dramas that gave her exposure to professional sets and working actors at a high level. She appeared in a recurring role in the comedy series In the Vault, and she had a notable appearance in the streaming series Everything Sucks, a Netflix production set in the 1990s that developed a dedicated following. Her role in that show, while not a lead part, demonstrated her ability to create a believable and emotionally grounded character within a limited amount of screen time. She also appeared in the Western drama series The Handmaid's Tale during this period, in a recurring capacity. Being part of a show of that caliber, working alongside established performers in a critically acclaimed production, was an important part of her professional development. She was absorbing technique and experience while still in her late teens, and it showed in the consistency and confidence of her subsequent work. The breakthrough, Euphoria, the role that genuinely changed Sydney Sweeney's career and introduced her to a massive mainstream audience, was Cassie Howard in the HBO drama series Euphoria. The show, created by Sam Levinson and based on an Israeli series, is a raw and unflinching examination of teenage life, addiction, trauma, identity, and sexuality. It features some of the most visually bold and emotionally intense content that American prestige television has produced, and it requires its cast to be willing to go to genuinely vulnerable places in their performances. Sydney joined the show in its first season, which premiered in 2019, as one of several major supporting characters surrounding the lead character Rue, played by Zendaya. Cassie Howard is a young woman whose identity has been almost entirely constructed around how men perceive her, and whose desperate need for love and validation leads her into a series of increasingly destructive choices. It is a complex and difficult role because the character is simultaneously sympathetic and frustrating, and because the show demands that Sweeney make the audience feel both of those things at once without letting either one cancel out the other. Sydney delivered a performance that was startling in its emotional rawness. There are scenes in Euphoria that required her to access levels of grief, desperation, and self-loathing that most performers twice her age would have struggled with, and she handled them with a maturity and an authenticity that earned her enormous critical praise. The role garnered her Emmy Award nominations, which was a remarkable achievement for a performer still in her early 20s. The second season of Euphoria, which aired in early 2022, expanded Cassie's role significantly, and Sydney rose to meet that expansion in spectacular fashion. A particular sequence in the second season, involving Cassie's increasingly unhinged emotional state and her relationship with a character named Nate, became one of the most discussed and analyzed scenes of that entire television year. It was the kind of performance that cemented her status not just as a rising star but as a genuinely serious actress. The Escalation, things begin to spiral as Millie spends more time in the Winchester household. The situation escalates in multiple directions simultaneously. Andrew's behavior becomes more aggressive and more dangerous. The power he holds over Millie becomes more explicit. And Millie, who entered this situation as someone trying to keep her head down and survive, begins to push back. Not recklessly, not immediately, but with a growing determination that something has to change. Meanwhile, the dynamic between Nina and Millie undergoes its own series of shifts. There are moments of unexpected solidarity between them, two women who both, in very different ways, are dealing with the same man. There are also moments of tension and suspicion, where Millie cannot tell whether Nina is trying to help her or trap her further, and where Nina seems genuinely uncertain how much of herself to reveal to this woman living in her attic. Enzo Accardi, the Italian groundskeeper who works on the Winchester property, also becomes an important figure during this stretch of the story. He is a man who exists at the margins of the household, close enough to see things, separate enough to perhaps be trusted. His connection to what is happening on the property, and his relationship with Millie, adds another thread to an already densely woven story. Evelyn Winchester, Andrew's mother, makes her presence felt as well. She is a formidable woman, deeply invested in maintaining the Winchester family's image and reputation, and she represents the broader social structure that has always protected Andrew. She is not a physical threat, but she is an obstacle, someone who will prioritize the family name over the truth of what has been happening in that house. Through all of this, young Cece remains a quiet and heartbreaking presence. She knows more than a child her age should know. She has grown up in an environment saturated with tension and unspoken violence, and it has left marks on her that the film does not shy away from showing. The confrontation. When the truth comes out, the final act of The Housemaid is where everything that has been building finally breaks open, and it does so in ways that are simultaneously shocking and, in retrospect, completely inevitable given everything the film has carefully laid out. The violence that erupts in the final portion of the film is not random or senseless. It is the direct result of everything that Andrew Winchester has done and the system of silence that has allowed him to do it for so long. Andrew's true nature is fully exposed, and the consequences of that exposure arrive with a force and an intensity that the film has been earning from the very first scene. What happens to him is brutal, and the film does not flinch from the brutality. But it is also, within the moral universe the story has constructed, a kind of justice. The kind of justice that institutions and systems failed to deliver, carried out instead by the women he underestimated and exploited. The role that Nina plays in what happens to Andrew is one of the film's most significant and carefully constructed reveals. Her choices in those final moments recast everything that came before in a new light, and the full picture of who Nina Winchester really is, and what she has been doing, and why, becomes devastatingly clear. The aftermath and the ending in the wake of what happens to Andrew, a policewoman named Jessica Connors is brought into the situation to investigate. Jessica is sharp and perceptive, and the evidence she examines does not entirely support the official explanation for Andrew's death. But here is where one of the film's most quietly powerful details emerges. Jessica mentions that her own sister was once engaged to Andrew Winchester. She knows exactly what kind of man he was. She has her own personal understanding of what he was capable of, and what it cost the women around him, and so Jessica makes a decision. She rules Andrew's death an accident and closes the case. It is not a conventional act of justice, but it is an act of understanding, one woman acknowledging the reality of what happened and choosing not to make the women who survived it pay any further price for their survival. After Andrew's funeral, Nina sits down with Millie and hands her a check for $100,000. It is a significant sum, and it is offered without explanation but with full understanding on both sides of what it represents. Then Nina takes Cece and leaves, to start a new life, away from the house, away from the estate, away from everything that happened inside those walls. She does not say where she is going, and that openness feels right. She is escaping, just as Millie has been trying to escape from the beginning of the story. And then comes the final beat of the film, the moment that closes the story with one of its darkest and most satisfying pieces of symmetry. Before Nina leaves, she recommends Millie's services to a friend. This friend, in the brief exchange we witness, makes it quietly clear that her own husband is abusive. And Millie, who has now been through the fire, who has survived everything that happened inside the Winchester house, who has come out the other side changed in ways she is only beginning to understand, she looks at this woman and asks, very simply, when she can start. It is an ending that is chilling, empowering, and deeply ambiguous all at once. Millie is not going back to being a victim. She is stepping into something else entirely, a role she has claimed for herself, on her own terms, in a world that has been trying to define her by her worst moment since the very beginning. Settling in, and the first signs of trouble, Millie moves into the Winchester estate and is shown to her room. Here is where the first deeply unsettling detail emerges, even if its significance does not fully register right away. The bedroom she is given is in the attic of the house. It is not a terrible room, but it is separated from the rest of the household in a way that feels deliberate. And the door to her room can be locked from the outside. That is not a detail the film allows you to ignore. It is placed there very deliberately, and it is the first quiet signal that everything about this house is not what it appears to be. In the first few days, Millie tries to settle in and do her job well. She cleans, she cooks, she looks after young Cece, Nina's daughter. Cece is a quiet, somewhat withdrawn child, and there is something in the way she moves through the house that suggests she too carries some weight that a child her age should not have to carry. Millie connects with her, and these moments between the two of them are among the most genuinely warm parts of an otherwise increasingly cold film. Nina continues to be charming and welcoming on the surface. She is attentive, she checks in on Millie, she is generous with praise. But there are small moments, glances, pauses, things that do not quite add up. Nina's warmth has a quality to it that is just slightly too performed. Too careful. Like someone who has practiced being warm rather than someone who simply is. And then there is Andrew Winchester, the real threat in the house. Andrew Winchester, Nina's husband, is exactly the kind of man who knows how to make an impression. He is handsome, polished, socially confident, and carries himself with the effortless ease of someone who has always had money and has never had to question whether the world would accommodate him. He is the kind of man who walks into a room and immediately dominates it, not through aggression but through sheer presence. He is also, from almost the moment Millie encounters him, deeply alarming. It starts subtly. Andrew pays a little too much attention to Millie. He notices her when he does not need to. He lingers in conversations. He finds reasons to be in the same room as her. None of it is immediately outright inappropriate, but there is an undercurrent to everything he does around her that makes her deeply uncomfortable. He has a way of looking at her that makes clear he sees her not as an employee but as something else entirely, something he has already decided he wants, and is simply waiting for the right moment to pursue. As the days go on, Andrew's behavior escalates. He begins making direct advances toward Millie. He uses his position of power, his wealth, and his knowledge of her vulnerability, her parole, her desperation, the fact that she has nowhere else to go, to pressure her in ways that are unmistakably predatory. He is not physically violent in these early stages, but the coercion is real and pervasive. He understands that Millie cannot simply walk away, and he exploits that understanding without any visible remorse. What becomes clear as the story develops is that Andrew has done this before. Millie is not the first vulnerable woman he has targeted. The Winchester household has employed other housemaids, and the reasons those previous employees left, or perhaps did not leave willingly, begin to become horribly apparent. Andrew operates within a system of privilege and power that has always protected him, and he has learned that women in Millie's position rarely fight back effectively because the consequences of doing so fall entirely on them and not on him. Nina. Nothing is as it seems as Millie's understanding of Andrew begins to deepen, so too does her confusion about Nina. Because Nina is not simply the oblivious, compliant wife she appears to be. There are moments where Nina seems to know exactly what her husband is doing and simply allows it to happen. There are other moments where she seems to be warning Millie without being able to say so directly. And there are still other moments where her behavior takes on a quality that is genuinely frightening, where the mask slips and you see something behind Nina's composed exterior that is not gracious or warm at all. The relationship between Millie and Nina is the most complex and fascinating dynamic in the entire film. It is not a simple story of a villain and a victim. Both women are operating from positions of constraint. Both women are, in their own very different ways, trapped, Nina by a marriage to a man who controls and abuses, Millie by her circumstances and her desperation. The film invites the audience to reconsider who the real victims and villains are in this story, and it does so in ways that are not always comfortable. There is a point in the film where what Nina knows and what she has been doing becomes much clearer, and it fundamentally changes how you understand everything that has happened up to that point. The revelation about Nina's true awareness of her husband's behavior, and what she has quietly allowed or even engineered, is one of the film's major pivots, and Amanda Seyfried plays it with extraordinary precision. You understand Nina's choices without necessarily forgiving them, and that moral complexity is one of the things that separates this film from a simpler domestic thriller. The Housemaid, 2025, the complete story setting the stage. Before we dive into the story itself, it is important to understand the world this film exists in. The Housemaid takes place largely within the walls of a grand, immaculate estate located in Great Neck, Long Island, New York. The house is enormous, beautiful, and almost aggressively perfect. Every surface gleams. Every room is decorated with precision. The kind of home that looks like it was designed not to be lived in, but to be admired. To be envied. That contrast between surface perfection and interior rot is the backbone of everything that happens in this story, and the filmmakers make sure you feel the weight of that environment from the very first moment you see it. Long Island's wealthy enclaves have long served as a symbol in American culture of a very particular kind of aspiration, the idea that if you have enough money, enough space, and the right address, you can construct a life that looks entirely flawless from the outside. The Housemaid tears that idea apart piece by piece. Millie Calloway, a woman with nowhere left. Our story begins with Millie Calloway, whose full name is Wilhelmina Calloway. Millie is a young woman in her late 20s who is, by any objective measure, in a desperate situation. She has recently been released on parole following a conviction for manslaughter. The details of exactly what happened and how she ended up with that conviction are not immediately clear at the start of the film, and that ambiguity is entirely intentional. The audience is meant to look at Millie and not be entirely sure what to make of her. Is she a victim of circumstances? Is she dangerous? Is she telling the truth about herself? These questions linger throughout the entire film and are a huge part of what makes her such a compelling character to follow. As a condition of her parole, Millie is required to maintain steady employment. This is not optional. If she cannot hold down a job and demonstrate that she is rebuilding her life responsibly, she goes back. so the pressure on her from the very beginning is immense. She is not just looking for a job because she wants one. She is looking for a job because her freedom depends on it. That desperation is written all over her from the opening scenes, and it makes every decision she makes throughout the rest of the film understandable even when those decisions begin to get complicated. Millie has no real support system. She does not have family to fall back on, no close friends who can help her get back on her feet, and very limited financial resources. She is essentially starting from zero, and the world is not particularly generous to people with criminal records who are trying to rebuild. Job interviews go nowhere. Landlords turn her away. Every door that should open stays shut. She is running out of options and running out of time. The interview that changes everything, then comes the interview that changes the entire direction of her life. Millie is connected to a job opportunity with a wealthy woman named Nina Winchester, who is looking for a live-in housemaid for her estate in Great Neck. The position involves maintaining the household, some light childcare for Nina's young daughter, and general domestic duties. In exchange, Millie would receive a salary and, crucially, a place to live on the property itself. For Millie, this is not just a job offer. It is a lifeline. It is exactly what she needs: stable employment, a roof over her head, and the kind of setup that would satisfy the requirements of her parole. She arrives at the Winchester estate for the interview and is immediately struck by how overwhelming the place is. The scale of it, the beauty of it, the almost surreal perfection of everything. And then she meets Nina. Nina Winchester is extraordinary to look at and extraordinary to talk to. She is warm, composed, gracious, and almost immediately puts Millie at ease. She asks questions with genuine interest, smiles with what appears to be real kindness, and seems completely unbothered by Millie's background. In a world where everyone has been turning Millie away because of her record, Nina's openness feels almost too good to be true. The interview goes well, remarkably well, actually. Nina offers Millie the position on the spot. Millie accepts without hesitation. How could she not? She has no other options, and this one seems genuinely perfect. Critical reception and audience response. The critical response to The Housemaid has been largely positive, though with some nuance. On Rotten Tomatoes, 73% of critics' reviews are positive based on nearly 200 reviews. The site's critical consensus describes the film as a sly throwback to the lurid thrillers that used to dominate multiplexes, one that cleans up nicely thanks to its wicked sense of fun and a delightfully unnerving performance from Amanda Seyfried. Several reviewers compared the film favorably to the erotic psychological thrillers of the 1990s, films like Single White Female and The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, while also acknowledging that The Housemaid brings its own modern sensibility to that well-worn genre. The Daily Telegraph gave it 4 out of 5 stars, describing it as a full-tilt throwback to erotic thriller tropes. The Wall Street Journal called it a delightful hall of mirrors in which reality turns out to be subject to infinite modification. The film carries an R rating for strong and bloody violent content, sexual assault, sexual content, nudity, and language, so it is definitively adult material and not something you want to watch with younger audiences. On the audience side, the reception has been enthusiastic and passionate, even if divided in some areas. The consensus among viewers is that Amanda Seyfried carries the film on her shoulders, that the twists are genuinely satisfying even if some of them are visible from a distance, and that the film delivers exactly what it promises: a stylish, seductive, and thoroughly unpredictable psychological thriller that keeps you glued to your seat from start to finish. Even the author of the original novel, Frida McFadden, went on record to say that after watching a preview, she turned to her husband and said the film might actually be better than the book. For an author to say that about an adaptation of their own work is genuinely remarkable, and it speaks to the quality and care that went into translating the story from page to screen. Final THOUGHTS The Housemaid is exactly the kind of film that the thriller genre needed in 2025. It is bold, stylish, committed to its own twisted logic, and anchored by performances, particularly from Amanda Seyfried, that elevate the material into something genuinely memorable. It is not a perfect film, and it is not trying to be. It is trying to be an exhilarating, entertaining, and deeply unsettling psychological experience, and on those terms it absolutely delivers. The box office numbers confirm that audiences agreed, and the fact that a sequel is already in development means this story is far from over. If you have not watched The Housemaid yet, this is your sign to do so. And if you have already seen it, drop your thoughts in the comments below. We want to know what you thought of the twists, which performance stood out most to you, and whether you think the sequel can match what this first film accomplished. Release date and box office. The Housemaid had its world premiere on December 2, 2025, at the AXA Equitable Center in New York City. It was a high-profile premiere event that generated considerable media attention and set the stage for the film's wide release. The film was then released in the United States on December 19, 2025, distributed by Lionsgate. The release date put it in direct competition with several other major titles including Avatar, Fire and Ash, and the SpongeBob movie, Search for SquarePants, which made its opening weekend performance all the more impressive. The film made $8 million on its very first day, including $2.3 million from Thursday night previews alone. It went on to open at $19 million in its first weekend, which placed it in third position at the box office behind its major competitors. What happened in the weeks that followed is where the story becomes even more interesting. The film held exceptionally well, dropping only 19.5% in its second weekend, a sign of genuinely strong word of mouth and audience enthusiasm. It continued to perform solidly through its third, fourth, and fifth weekends as well. In total, the film grossed an impressive $399.2 million worldwide against a production budget of just $35 million. Those numbers make it a significant commercial success by any measure, and they have already contributed to the decision to move forward with a sequel, with both Paul Feig and Sydney Sweeney confirmed to return. In the United Kingdom and Ireland, the film opened on December 22, 2025, through Odeon and other theater chains, where it similarly generated strong audience turnout. Trailer Informatio and the trailers for The Housemaid were a major part of how the film built its pre-release excitement. The promotional campaign was carefully structured to reveal just enough to hook audiences without giving away the film's most important twists. The initial teaser trailer established the tone immediately. You see the polished, sun-drenched exterior of the Winchester estate, the warmth of Nina's welcome, and the apparent promise of a fresh start for Millie. And then, without warning, the mood shifts entirely. The imagery turns cold and unsettling, the music changes, and you begin to understand that this is not a story about a housemaid settling into a comfortable new life. The contrast between the beautiful surface and the dark undertow was captured perfectly in those early promotional materials. The final trailer arrived in December, just before the film's premiere, and it gave audiences a more direct sense of the film's escalating tension and its willingness to go to genuinely dark and unexpected places. Amanda Seyfried herself described the trailer as something that really encapsulates how nuts and unpredictable the movie is. The trailers are available on Lionsgate's official YouTube channel and are absolutely worth watching before or after you see the film, because they are crafted with real care and give you a strong sense of what kind of experience you are signing up for. Plot details. What happens in the movie? The story centers on a young woman named Wilhelmina Calloway, who goes by Millie. Millie is not in a good place when we first meet her. She is out on parole after being convicted of manslaughter, and she is trying desperately to rebuild her life and find stable work as a condition of her release. She has a troubled past, a criminal record, and very limited options, which makes her vulnerable in a way that becomes extremely important as the story develops. One day, Millie lands a job interview with a woman named Nina Winchester. Nina is the picture of wealth and elegance, a polished, warm, and seemingly gracious woman who lives in a stunning estate in Great Neck, Long Island with her husband Andrew and their young daughter Cecilia, who is called Cece. Nina needs a live-in housemaid, and she offers Millie the position after their first meeting. For Millie, this feels like a genuine lifeline. A place to stay, a steady income, and a chance to start fresh. She accepts without hesitation. But from the very first night, something feels off. Millie is given an attic bedroom that can be locked from the outside. That detail alone is deeply unsettling, and it sets the tone for everything that follows. As Millie settles into the household, she begins to notice that the Winchester family is not the warm and welcoming unit they appeared to be. Andrew Winchester, Nina's husband, is charming on the surface, but there is something deeply wrong with the way he behaves. He is manipulative, controlling, and it becomes increasingly clear that he has a pattern of targeting and exploiting vulnerable women exactly like Millie. What begins as a job quickly becomes something far more complicated and dangerous. Andrew begins pursuing Millie in a way that makes her deeply uncomfortable, and the power dynamics within the house start shifting in unpredictable and frightening ways. Nina, meanwhile, is a far more complex character than she first appears. She is not simply the oblivious, perfectly composed wife she presents herself as. There are layers to Nina, and as those layers are peeled back, the audience is forced to completely rethink everything they thought they understood about her character and her motivations. The film builds carefully through its first and second acts, layering tension and dropping hints that things are far more dangerous than they appear. There are moments of dark seduction, psychological manipulation, and genuine horror as the reality of Millie's situation becomes clearer. The twists in this film are significant, and several of them genuinely reframe everything that came before. Without giving everything away, the story escalates into a confrontation that involves violence, betrayal, and a kind of dark female solidarity that ties the whole narrative together in a way that feels both shocking and strangely satisfying. A policewoman named Jessica Connors also enters the picture, and her involvement adds another layer to the mystery. Her connection to Andrew Winchester turns out to be deeply personal, and her role in how everything concludes is one of the more interesting decisions the film makes in its final stretch. By the time the ending arrives, both Nina and Millie have revealed themselves to be far more capable, far more dangerous, and far more determined than the world around them expected them to be. The film closes on a note that is simultaneously dark, empowering, and wide open for more story, which makes sense given that a sequel is already in development. Cast. Who brings this story to life? The casting of the housemaid is one of the most discussed aspects of the entire production, and for very good reason. Every major role in this film is occupied by a performer who brings something genuinely distinctive to the table. Sydney Sweeney plays the lead role of Millie Calloway. Sweeney has been one of the most prominent young actresses in Hollywood over the past several years, known for her work in Euphoria and other high-profile projects. Here, she takes on a character who is simultaneously sympathetic and increasingly difficult to read as the story progresses. Millie begins the film as a victim of circumstance, but she does not remain purely passive, and Sweeney handles that evolution with a commitment that won over a good portion of the audience, even if some critics felt her performance had its uneven moments. Amanda Seyfried plays Nina Winchester, and by virtually unanimous agreement among both critics and audiences, she is the standout of the entire film. Seyfried delivers a performance that is genuinely layered and unpredictable. Nina is charming, then unnerving, then pitiable, then frightening, sometimes within the same scene. Seyfried makes every single one of those transitions feel completely earned, and it is the kind of role that reminds you just how good she is when given material worthy of her abilities. Critics repeatedly singled her out as the reason the film works as well as it does. Brandon Sklenar plays Andrew Winchester, the wealthy and dangerous husband at the center of all the chaos. Sklenar, who came to wider attention through It Ends With Us and Drop, brings a slick and deeply unsettling menace to Andrew. He is exactly the kind of villain who is believable because he does not look or act like a villain at first. He is handsome, smooth, and socially confident, which makes the ugliness underneath far more disturbing when it surfaces. Michele Morrone plays Enzo Accardi, an Italian groundskeeper connected to the Winchester estate. His presence adds another layer of intrigue and tension to the story, and Morrone brings a brooding charisma to the role that makes him an interesting foil to the other characters. Elizabeth Perkins plays Evelyn Winchester, Andrew's mother. The presence of a formidable mother-in-law figure adds yet another dimension to the family dynamics at the heart of the story, and Perkins handles the role with the kind of sharp, controlled energy the character demands. Indiana L. plays Cecilia, the young daughter of the Winchester household. Cece is a quieter presence in the film but an important one. She represents the innocence that the adults around her are failing to protect, and her relationship with Millie gives the story some of its more genuinely tender moments amid all the darkness. The Housemaid is a 2025 American erotic psychological thriller film directed by Paul Feig and written by Rebecca Sonnenschein. It is based on the 2022 best-selling novel of the same name written by author Frida McFadden. Now, if you are someone who follows the thriller genre in literature, you already know that Frida McFadden's novel was an absolutely massive hit. It captured readers with its sharp twists, its deeply unreliable characters, and its suffocating atmosphere of domestic tension. The book became one of those rare stories that people simply could not stop recommending to one another, and it built up a fan base that was genuinely passionate and protective of the source material. So when it was announced that the book was being adapted into a major Hollywood film, the anticipation was already at a very high level even before a single frame was shot. The film is an American production, set and filmed in the United States, with a large portion of its story unfolding on Long Island in New York. The location itself plays a surprisingly important role in the overall atmosphere of the film. Long Island's wealthy suburban neighborhoods, with their grand estates, manicured lawns, and the illusion of perfect family life, become almost like a character of their own. There is something about that environment, that picture-perfect, upper-class American domesticity, that makes the darkness underneath feel even more unsettling when it finally begins to surface. The film was directed by Paul Feig, who is a filmmaker best known for crowd-pleasers and critically appreciated comedies like Bridesmaids, Spy, and Another Simple Favor. Bringing Feig on board for a film like this was a very deliberate and interesting choice. He understands how to balance dark, uncomfortable material with sharp entertainment value, and he knows how to keep an audience engaged even when the story goes to genuinely strange and disturbing places. That skill is very much on display throughout The Housemaid. He does not let the film become so heavy that it loses its entertainment factor, but he also does not shy away from the darkness that made the source novel so compelling. The screenplay was handled by Rebecca Sonnenschein, who had the difficult task of condensing a layered, twist-heavy novel into a 2-hour-plus film while keeping the most important emotional beats and surprises intact. At its core, The Housemaid is a story about power, desperation, secrets, and what happens when the lives of two very different women collide inside the walls of a house that is hiding far more than it lets on. It is the kind of film that keeps you watching very closely because you are never entirely sure who to trust, and that uncertainty is what makes the whole experience so gripping from beginning to end. The revival of adult-oriented cinema, The Housemaid 2025, also occupies an important place in a larger cultural conversation about the health and future of adult-oriented cinema in Hollywood. For roughly a decade before the film's release, the Hollywood studio system had become increasingly dominated by franchise films, superhero movies, animated features, and other forms of entertainment that were designed to appeal to the widest possible audience demographic. Original, adult-oriented films, films made for grown-up audiences, featuring complex characters, mature themes, and stories that did not require existing intellectual property as a foundation, had been gradually pushed to the margins of the studio system. This trend had real cultural consequences. It meant that a generation of filmmakers who wanted to make the kinds of films that had defined Hollywood's most celebrated eras, complex dramas, sharp thrillers, character-driven stories, were finding it increasingly difficult to get those films made within the studio system. Many moved to streaming platforms, which had somewhat different economics and were more willing to take risks on original material, at least for a period. But even the streaming landscape had begun to shift toward franchise content as the economics of the streaming business evolved. The Housemaid 2025 arrived as a direct and powerful counterexample to the narrative that adult-oriented cinema was commercially non-viable. A mid-budget psychological thriller, rated R, featuring complex adult themes and no franchise connection, aimed squarely at grown-up audiences, and it grossed nearly $400 million worldwide. That number is not just a commercial statistic. It is a cultural argument, made in the most compelling possible language for the Hollywood system, that there is an enormous and underserved audience for exactly this kind of film. The film's success was widely discussed in the industry in exactly these terms, as evidence that the appetite for adult-oriented cinema had not disappeared but had simply been denied adequate product to feed it. The film proved that when you give adult audiences a well-crafted, genuinely engaging story built on strong performances and intelligent writing, they will show up in numbers that rival or exceed what franchise films can achieve. That proof had significant implications for the kinds of films that studios and streaming platforms would consider greenlighting in the years following. The South Korean parallel. A note on global domestic thrillers It is worth noting, in a discussion of the cultural and historical context of The Housemaid 2025, that the tradition of using the domestic space, particularly the relationship between a wealthy household and the people who serve within it, as the setting for exploration of class conflict and hidden violence has deep roots not just in American and British literary tradition but in global cinema as well. South Korean cinema in particular has produced some of the most celebrated and culturally significant explorations of this territory in recent decades. Bong Joon-ho's Parasite, which won the Academy Award for Best Picture in 2020, is the most prominent example, a film that uses the relationship between a wealthy family and the people who infiltrate their household to deliver a devastating critique of class inequality, social aspiration, and the violence that structures capitalist society. The film was celebrated globally because it articulated something that audiences around the world recognized, regardless of their specific cultural context. The older South Korean film, also titled The Housemaid, directed by Kim Ki-young and originally released in 1960, is itself a landmark of world cinema, a deeply unsettling and psychologically complex exploration of desire, power, and domestic catastrophe that anticipated many of the thematic concerns that the 2025 American film engages with. The fact that the American film shares its title with this Korean classic is not coincidental. It places the American production within a global conversation about domestic space, power, and the violence that privilege enables and conceals. This global dimension of the film's cultural context is important because it reminds us that the anxieties The Housemaid explores are not uniquely American. The dynamics of class, gender, power, and domestic exploitation that the film depicts are recognizable across vastly different cultural contexts, which is part of the reason the film performed so strongly in international markets. The specific details are American, but the underlying human realities are universal. The film may as a cultural mirror what The Housemaid 2025 ultimately represents, in its broadest cultural and historical significance, is a mirror held up to a specific moment in American and global culture, a moment defined by acute awareness of inequality, by the ongoing reckoning with how power is abused in intimate spaces, by the growing recognition that the domestic sphere has always been a site of political struggle even when it has been presented as a private refuge from politics, and by a hunger for stories that take women's experiences of exploitation and survival seriously rather than treating them as supporting material for someone else's story. The film draws on 2 centuries of literary tradition, a specific history of Hollywood genre filmmaking, the social and political upheavals of the post-MeToo moment, the transformation of literary culture by digital communities, and the structural realities of American economic inequality. It synthesizes all of these elements into a story that is entertaining, stylish, and commercially successful, and that in being all of those things simultaneously, demonstrates that the most culturally resonant stories are almost always the ones that connect with something real and enduring in the human experience of the world. The house in The Housemaid is not just a house. It is a symbol of everything that wealth and privilege seeks to hide, everything that power does when it operates without accountability, and everything that the women who enter those spaces risk when they have nowhere else to go. That is not just a movie premise. That is history. That is culture. That is a conversation that humanity has been having for a very long time, and that The Housemaid 2025 joins with intelligence, style, and a genuine understanding of what that conversation is actually about. Female rage and solidarity in contemporary storytelling. One of the most significant cultural dimensions of The Housemaid 2025 is its participation in what has been identified as one of the defining trends in contemporary storytelling: the centrality of female rage and the complex possibilities of female solidarity. The post-MeToo cultural moment produced an enormous wave of stories, in literature, in film, in television, that centered on women's anger. Not the domesticated, safely channeled anger that had always been permitted in stories about women, but raw, uncontrolled, sometimes violent rage at the systems and individuals that had exploited and constrained them. This wave of storytelling was not simply popular in a commercial sense. It was culturally necessary. It provided language and narrative form for experiences that had previously been impossible to articulate in mainstream culture, and it created a space for audiences, particularly women, to recognize their own experiences and feelings in stories that validated rather than dismissed them. The Housemaid participates in this tradition in a way that is both direct and nuanced. The rage that drives the film's climactic moments is not presented as a simple triumph. It is presented as a complex, morally ambiguous response to an impossible situation, the kind of response that women are driven to when every legitimate avenue of recourse has been closed off to them. The film does not celebrate violence uncritically, but it does insist that the anger behind that violence is legitimate, that it has causes that are real and structural, and that the real question is not why these women reacted the way they did but why the systems that should have protected them failed so catastrophically. The relationship between Millie and Nina, 2 women who are in many ways each other's adversaries for much of the film, and who ultimately find a kind of solidarity rooted in their shared experience of the same predatory man, is one of the most culturally resonant elements of the entire story. It refuses the simple narrative of female competition, the idea that women in proximity to the same powerful man must inevitably be rivals. Instead, it insists on the possibility of understanding and connection between women whose experiences of the same abuser have been radically different, but whose fundamental interests ultimately align. That insistence is deeply rooted in the feminist cultural conversations of the past decade and reflects a cultural moment in which those conversations have moved from the margins to the mainstream. BookTok and the new cultural GATKEPRS. The cultural story of The Housemaid 2025 is also inseparable from the story of how literary culture changed in the digital age, and specifically how the community of readers on TikTok, collectively known as BookTok, transformed the publishing industry and created new pathways for books to reach massive audiences. Freida McFadden's novel was published in 2022, and its rise to bestseller status was driven in significant part by BookTok. The platform's community of passionate, vocal readers discovered the book, loved it, talked about it extensively, recommended it to their followers, and created a groundswell of enthusiasm that translated directly into enormous sales figures. At the peak of the novel's BookTok popularity, McFadden's books represented approximately 3% of all adult fiction sold in the United States in a given year, a staggering market share for any single author. This is historically significant because it represents a fundamental shift in how culture moves from creators to audiences. For most of the 20th century, the gatekeepers of literary culture were a relatively small number of critics, publishers, and media outlets. A book's success was heavily dependent on whether it received attention from those gatekeepers. BookTok completely disrupted that model. It created a system in which ordinary readers with genuine enthusiasm could drive a book to bestseller status through the sheer force of their passion and their audience, entirely independently of whether the traditional critical establishment had endorsed it. The film adaptation of The Housemaid benefited from this cultural infrastructure in the most direct possible way. The BookTok community that had made the novel a phenomenon was primed and eager for the film, and it used the same platforms and the same community mechanisms to drive audiences into theaters. The film's extraordinary word-of-mouth performance, its remarkable ability to hold its audience week after week, was driven substantially by the same online community that had made the book a sensation, now redirecting its enthusiasm toward the screen adaptation. This is a new model of cultural transmission, and The Housemaid 2025 is one of the clearest and most successful examples of how it works. The #MeToo movement and IT's influence on the film. It is impossible to discuss the cultural context of The Housemaid 2025 without addressing the influence of the MeToo movement, which erupted in 2017 and fundamentally transformed the way American culture talks about sexual abuse, predatory behavior in positions of power, and the structural conditions that allow powerful men to exploit vulnerable people for extended periods without facing consequences. The MeToo moment did not create the problems. It exposed. Those problems had existed for generations, as the historical context discussed above makes clear. What it did was change the cultural framework within which those problems could be openly named and discussed. It created a space in which women's accounts of abuse and exploitation were taken seriously rather than dismissed, and in which the mechanisms that powerful men had historically used to silence and discredit their victims — wealth, social standing, legal resources, institutional protection — became visible as mechanisms of injustice rather than simply as facts of life. Andrew Winchester, the villain of The Housemaid, is a character who belongs entirely to the post-MeToo cultural imagination. He is not a monster who exists outside the normal social order. He is a product of that order, a man whose wealth, charm, and social position have always protected him, who has learned over years of experience that women in vulnerable positions will not be believed if they speak against him, and who has exploited that understanding systematically and without remorse. He is recognizable not because he is extreme but because he is familiar, the kind of man whose behavior the MeToo movement has spent years making visible to a culture that had been trained not to see it. The film's treatment of the justice that ultimately comes for Andrew is also culturally significant in a MeToo context. That justice does not come from institutions, not from the law, not from the social structures that should have protected Andrew's victims long before the events of the film. It comes from the women he targeted and exploited, acting in ways that the institutions failed to provide for. This is not an endorsement of vigilante violence in any simple sense. It is a reflection of a cultural conversation that MeToo initiated about what justice looks like when formal institutions fail, a conversation that has no easy answers but that the film engages with honestly and without pretending the answers are simple. Class and wealth. The American Inequality Dimension in The Housemaid 2025 is also a film deeply embedded in the cultural moment of extreme economic inequality that has defined American life in the 21st century. The gap between the Winchesters and Millie Calloway is not just a plot device, it is a reflection of a social reality that American culture has been grappling with intensely in recent years. The period in which the film was made and set is one in which wealth inequality in the United States has reached levels not seen since the Gilded Age of the late 19th century. The ultra-wealthy have pulled further and further away from the rest of the population, and the mechanisms by which ordinary people might once have achieved economic security have been systematically eroded. Housing costs have become prohibitive, wages have stagnated relative to the cost of living, and the safety net for people who fall through the cracks of the system has been dramatically weakened. Millie Calloway exists at the extreme end of this inequality, a woman who, because of a criminal record, has been largely shut out of the mainstream economy and is dependent for survival on whatever work she can find in the margins. The Winchester estate represents the other end of the same spectrum. Wealth so enormous that it is literally incomprehensible to someone in Millie's position, a world of private estates and household staff and Broadway tickets purchased on a whim that exists in a different universe from the one Millie inhabits. The film understands that this inequality is not just backdrop, it is the engine that drives the entire story. Millie is vulnerable to Andrew Winchester not simply because he is a bad person but because the economic conditions of her life have placed her in a position of complete dependence on people like him. She cannot walk away, cannot refuse, cannot appeal to authorities who might protect her, because the consequences of any of those actions fall entirely on her and not on the man who is abusing his power. This is not a personal failing. It is a structural condition, and the film is aware of that distinction even when it does not state it explicitly. The portrayal of Long Island wealth in the film, the immaculate interiors, the designer clothes, the casual assumption that the world will accommodate every preference and demand, functions as a kind of cultural critique of a specific American class mythology. The Winchester world looks perfect because enormous amounts of money have been spent to make it look that way. But the perfection is a performance, and what it is performing is a version of American success that conceals the exploitation on which it is built. The history of domestic space in American culture. The specific American dimension of the housemaid's cultural significance requires its own exploration. The film is set in Great Neck, Long Island, a location that carries enormous symbolic weight within American cultural history and mythology. Long Island's North Shore, which includes Great Neck and the surrounding communities, was the setting that F. Scott Fitzgerald used for The Great Gatsby, one of the defining works of American literature and one of the most powerful explorations of wealth, aspiration, and the corruption that lies beneath the surface of the American dream. The area's grand estates, its proximity to New York City wealth, and its long history as a destination for the extraordinarily affluent gave it a specific resonance in the American imagination. It is a place that represents what money can buy in America, and therefore a place that also represents what money cannot ultimately protect you from. By setting the housemaid in this specific geography, the filmmakers were making a deliberate and historically informed choice. They were placing their story within a landscape that American culture has long used to examine, the gap between how the wealthy present themselves to the world and what actually happens behind the walls of their estates. The Winchester House is, in a very real sense, a descendant of Gatsby's West Egg Mansion, a place that looks like a dream from the outside and operates as something far darker from within. The history of domestic service in America adds another crucial layer to the film's cultural meaning. The relationship between employers and live-in domestic workers, housemaids, governesses, servants of all kinds, has always been one of the most complex and ethically fraught relationships in American social life. It is a relationship defined by profound power imbalance. The employer controls the worker's living situation, their income, their daily schedule, and often their access to food and shelter. The worker is inside the most intimate spaces of the employer's life, their home, their bedrooms, their family dynamics, while simultaneously being expected to be invisible, to perform servility, and to have no needs or desires of their own that conflict with the employer's comfort. This dynamic has deep roots in American history. The institution of slavery, which defined American domestic labor for generations, cast a long shadow over all subsequent forms of domestic service. Even after emancipation, the domestic worker, particularly women, and particularly women of limited economic means, occupied a position in American society that was defined by extreme vulnerability. They had few legal protections, little recourse when abused, and were dependent for their survival on the goodwill of the people who employed them. The power a wealthy employer held over a live-in domestic worker was, and in many contexts continues to be, almost absolute. The housemaid draws on this history directly. Millie's vulnerability is not just personal, it is structural. She is a woman with a criminal record, on parole, without financial resources, dependent for both her income and her housing on the Winchesters. The film understands that her situation is not simply the result of bad luck or bad choices. It is the result of a system, legal, economic, and social, that places certain people in positions of extreme vulnerability and then does very little to protect them from those who would exploit that vulnerability. The cultural weight of that history is present throughout every scene in which Millie navigates the constraints of her position. The 1990s erotic thriller, The Immediate Historical PREDCSSOR. The most immediate historical context for The Housemaid 2025 is the wave of erotic psychological thrillers that dominated Hollywood in the late 1980s and early 1990s. This genre was one of the defining cinematic forms of its era, and its cultural legacy is enormously significant. Films like Fatal Attraction, released in 1987, Basic Instinct in 1992, Single White Female in 1992, The Hand That Rocks the Cradle in 1992, Unlawful Entry in 1992, and Disclosure in 1994, among many others, defined a specific mode of Hollywood filmmaking that combined explicit sexuality, psychological manipulation, and escalating violence within narratives that were almost always structured around domestic or intimate spaces. These films were wildly popular. They attracted enormous audiences, generated massive box office returns, and dominated cultural conversation in ways that few genres in any era have managed to match. The erotic thriller of the 1990s was also deeply shaped by the anxieties of its historical moment. These were films that emerged in the wake of second-wave feminism and the broader cultural renegotiation of gender roles that had been taking place since the 1970s. They were, In many respects, films that expressed profound anxiety about those changes, films that often positioned independent, sexually active, professionally ambitious women as threats to domestic stability. The cultural politics embedded in many of these films have been extensively analyzed and critiqued in the decades since, and that critique is part of what makes The Housemaid 2025 such an interesting response to the tradition. Because The Housemaid 2025 is not simply reproducing the 1990s erotic thriller formula. It is engaging with that formula consciously and critically, borrowing its aesthetics and its genre mechanics while fundamentally reorienting its moral perspective. Where the 1990s erotic thriller frequently positioned the threatening woman as the villain whose elimination was necessary to restore domestic order, The Housemaid 2025 inverts that structure entirely. Here, the threat to domestic order is not the independent woman who enters from outside, it is the man of the house himself, the patriarch whose wealth and social position have protected him from accountability for a very long time. The genre's aesthetics are preserved, but the gender politics are completely reversed, and that reversal is one of the most culturally significant things the film does. The 1990s erotic thriller gradually declined as a commercially dominant form through the later part of the decade and into the 2000s. Various factors contributed to this decline: changing cultural attitudes, the rise of other genres, and the increasing availability of content through home video that shifted audience behavior in theaters. The genre did not disappear entirely, but it ceased to be the dominant commercial force it had briefly been. The Housemaid 2025 represents a conscious and culturally significant revival of the form, updated for a very different cultural moment and inflected with a very different set of values. The Gothic literary tradition, where it all begins to understand where The Housemaid comes from culturally and historically, you have to go back much further than the 1990s thriller era that most people associate it with. You have to go back to the 19th century, to the tradition of Gothic literature that produced some of the most enduring and influential works in the English language. Gothic literature as a form was defined by several recurring elements: grand, imposing houses that function as symbols of hidden secrets and repressed emotions, powerful figures who dominate and control those beneath them, women who are trapped within domestic spaces by circumstances beyond their control, and an atmosphere of creeping dread that builds slowly rather than erupting suddenly. The house in Gothic fiction is never simply a house. It is always a container for everything that a family or a society wants to hide from the world, and the act of entering that house, of becoming part of its household, is always an act that carries enormous risk. Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, published in 1847, is perhaps the most direct and significant ancestor of the story that The Housemaid tells. In that novel, a young woman of limited means and social standing takes a position as a governess in a grand estate called Thornfield Hall, working for a brooding and complex employer. The house conceals a terrible secret in its upper reaches, a secret that directly threatens the safety and autonomy of the woman who has entered its walls. The parallels to The Housemaid are not accidental. The attic in particular, both in Jane Eyre and in The Housemaid, functions as a powerful symbol of everything that wealth and privilege seeks to suppress and contain. Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, published in 1938, is another enormously significant predecessor. In that novel, a young woman of modest background becomes the wife of a wealthy man and moves into his vast and beautiful estate, only to find herself psychologically dominated by the memory and legacy of his previous wife. The house, called Manderley, is suffused with the presence of someone who should be absent, and the new wife's attempts to establish herself within its walls are constantly undermined by forces she cannot fully see or understand. The dynamics of power, class, psychological manipulation, and domestic entrapment in Rebecca are directly echoed in the housemaid's treatment of Millie's situation within the Winchester estate. Mary Higgins Clark, the celebrated American author of domestic suspense fiction, represents a more recent but still deeply important strand of this tradition. Clark built an entire career on stories set within the comfortable domestic spaces of upper-middle-class and wealthy American life. Stories where the veneer of respectability concealed violence, manipulation, and moral corruption. Her work demonstrated that American audiences had a powerful and persistent appetite for exactly this kind of story, and she built a readership that spanned decades. The scholarly concept known as the madwoman in the attic, drawn from a landmark 1979 academic work of feminist literary criticism, is directly relevant to understanding the housemaid as a cultural artifact. That concept describes the pattern in 19th century literature of confining women who do not conform to societal expectations within domestic spaces, literally or metaphorically imprisoning them and labeling them as irrational or unstable in order to maintain patriarchal control. The housemaid engages with this concept both directly and subversively. The attic bedroom where Millie is housed, the room that can be locked from the outside, is a very deliberate invocation of this literary tradition, and the film's treatment of which characters are actually mad and which are simply being systematically driven toward the appearance of madness is one of its most culturally sophisticated elements. Why cultural context matters for this film. When we watch a movie, we are almost never watching something that exists in a vacuum. Every film is a product of the time and place in which it was created, and the best films are those that tap into something deeper than their immediate story, something that connects to the broader anxieties, questions, and conversations that a society is having with itself at any given moment. The Housemaid 2025 is one of those films. It is a movie that is entertaining on its surface, thrilling and stylish and full of twists, but underneath that surface it is engaging with a set of cultural, historical, and social conversations that run very deep indeed. Understanding those conversations does not just enrich your appreciation of the film, it fundamentally changes how you see it. So let us go all the way back and trace the full cultural and historical context of The Housemaid from its roots to its significance in the modern moment.